Well, good morning. Thank you for your time today. We're always grateful to be able to connect with you all. My name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Before we get started, I wanted to point out that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function, so please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They will answer your questions directly, but they'll also let me know of any questions that they think would be helpful for the entire group. I do also want to note that if you don't have time to stick around for a response or an answer, or if you leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. So the plan for today is to cover the new feature to create custom sign-in console questions that are delivered to your volunteers when using either mobile sign-in or the standalone sign-in console. So during the course of our conversation today, we'll overview the sign-in console and its functionalities. We'll talk about the use case for mobile sign-in, and then we'll dive into the updates for custom sign-in console questions, as well as having your volunteers digitally sign your terms and conditions as a part of the sign-in process. So first, let's start off by overviewing the sign-in console. So the sign-in console is a standalone kiosk that you can set up on any sort of internet-connected device. So that could be a tablet or a laptop or a desktop, really anything with an internet browser that would be capable of letting your volunteers sign in at a location. So it's designed as an electronic check-in device. You can have volunteers just track their attendance by signing in, but you can also have volunteers sign out when they leave to record exactly how long they were there and have their hours modified by those two times. The sign-in console can be opened by anyone with higher than volunteer access. So that would be your event leaders, group leaders, leadership team, and administrators. The option to open the sign-in console is found under the event or project management heading. It's the last option, event or project sign-in console. And when you click on that dialog, it'll bring up a few options pertaining to the sign-in console. Now, some of these options are related to settings in your system configuration. So when you open your sign-in console, you may not see all of these settings initially. And we'll talk about how to turn these on a little bit later on today. But let's go through these options. So the first one is your interest category filter. If you'd like to, you can have this instance of your sign-in console be filtered to a particular interest category, which would include its subcategories as well. This is generally useful if you are opening up sign-in consoles at different locations and you have interest categories that represent those locations. Like I said, you can use these interest category filters to make sure that your sign-in console only delivers a certain subset of your events and not all of the events within your system. And again, that could be by program or by location. It just depends on how your interest categories are established. You can also just let your interest categories filters be off and have all of your events displayed in this particular sign-in console. The next three options here have to do with name tags, and name tags being printed on demand. So those name tags, again, this is a setting in the system configuration, so you may not see this right away, and we'll talk about how to enable this. But this would allow the system to print out name tags automatically as soon as volunteers sign in. So this does use a particular type of printer. It's a Dymo label writer in the 450 series. There's a few versions of that. But again, these settings will only show up if you have that turned on. And you can have name tags printed on this device or from this device if you have the printer connected to it, or you can have them printed remotely. So for example, if you have multiple tablets set up in a lobby, you could have all of them printing to the same device. So if you have any questions about these settings or options, we can dive into that further. Feel free to use the chat. I'm not going to cover them too much further here. The last option is when adding a new volunteer via walk-in registration. So again, this is pertaining to a setting. You may not see this right away. If you do allow walk-in registration, and I'll show you how to turn that on later, then this would allow volunteers to create accounts on site as a part of the registration process or as a part of the sign-in process. And they can also sign in for shifts day of. So normally the sign-in console operates on the basis that volunteers are registering beforehand and then just checking in or signing in when they arrive. But this option would allow volunteers to create a profile as a part of the registration process or part of the sign-in process, and also sign in for events day of. They don't need to necessarily pre-register. And then this option specifically allows you to select if you want to use your full profile for those new accounts or what we call Quick Reg, which is essentially a truncated version of the application page. Now, the most important option here actually is at the bottom. There's two buttons, sign-in mode and admin mode. Generally speaking, you're going to want to use sign-in mode. Admin mode is used if you yourself are signing people in. So if we go ahead and click on this, you can see that it says that I am actually still logged in as an admin. You can see that at the top of the page here. It has my time remaining clock, so this will actually log me out after a certain amount of time of inactivity. And because I'm logged in on the admin side, I can see everyone who's currently signed in. So if you just want to check on who is signed in, maybe sign a few people in yourself or sign people out, this is a useful tool for that. But you would not want to allow volunteers to utilize this version because, again, it's not going to stay open. It's going to log itself out. And most importantly, you are still logged in as an administrator, meaning there's a main dashboard button. I can go back to the main dashboard and I have access to the entire system. So typically when you open the sign-in console, you're going to want to use sign-in mode. So sign-in mode will log you out. You will no longer see that login bar at the top. You won't see a main dashboard button to go back. And you're also not going to see everybody who's currently signed in. But volunteers can utilize this to sign themselves in. So they would search for their name through here. If they already have an account, they'll see that name. If they don't have an account, they can click to add a new profile. And again, this is dependent on whether or not you have walk-in registration turned on. So if you're not seeing it like this, that would be why. But if a volunteer sees their name, they can click on that name. That'll bring them to the sign-in questionnaire, which is the new feature. So these questions can be established in the system configuration. We'll talk about how to create these and what that all looks like. I just have 3 examples set up currently. So these examples here just ask a volunteer a couple questions pertaining to COVID specifically, about whether or not they have had symptoms or they've been in contact with someone who tested positive, and then also a temperature check at the time of check-in. So these questions are a way for me to gather information. This information is stored on the volunteer's profile as a note once they answer these questions and successfully submit. But these also allow me to prevent some registrations if people answer a way that I don't want them to or that I can't have them answer. So for example, in these 2 cases here, if they have any symptoms, if they say yes to this, or if they say yes, they've been in contact with someone who's tested positive, I am using those as a restriction. So when someone attempts to sign in, so they'd have to, in this case, agree to my terms too. But if they don't answer those questions the way that I need them to, the system will actually stop them from signing in. So they won't have permission to sign in if they don't meet the requirements. So it's going to ask them, to double check their answers to make sure they didn't just check something in error. But if those are their correct answers, then they're not allowed to sign in, and it tells them to see a staff member for additional assistance. Otherwise, if they do answer those questions correctly, and then again, they also are presented with these terms and conditions. This is another part of this update. This allows you to have your terms posted to volunteers not only when they're creating their accounts from home initially or updating their profiles from home, but also on the sign-in console itself. So if a volunteer does not have the current terms signed in their profile, then they will need to sign those before they can sign in. If they've already signed these terms a week ago, a day ago, a month ago, even a year ago, they won't be presented those again. It's just if the terms themselves have been updated. So if you make new terms once a year, it's going to require your volunteers to sign those if you're using the sign-in console and have this feature enabled. I'm going to go ahead and click on Submit now. Everything should be correct. And that's going to allow me to sign in or to sign out if I had previously signed in. So volunteers initially see on this screen any event or service project that they are already registered for. So those options will show up initially. If they're not already registered for something and you have walk-in turned on, then that's what they'll see. They'll see all the available walk-in opportunities. Now, I'm registered for a couple things happening today, as well as service projects that are ongoing, but I could also choose to see what else is going on and sign in for something else if I wanted to. So when someone signs in, it's just going to present an option that they've been successfully signed in. This dialog will disappear in a moment, but the next volunteer could already be using this to sign themselves in. And it's the exact same process for any other person. So that's what the sign-in console looks like when you have it set up in this manner. Now, again, this will stay open as long as the device is on. This will also basically allow you to keep that open on as many devices at the same time as you need to. So you could have multiple opportunities for volunteers to sign in at different locations, things like that. And this can stay open all day long. Now, to close the sign-in console, we have intentionally hidden the option within this menu. You search for the term exit or close, and that'll bring up a dialog to close the sign-in console, and that'll take you back to the admin login page. Before we go there, I do want to show you signing out. So we'll go back to this in a moment. But that exit option is intentionally hidden so that volunteers aren't just closing the sign-in console on your behalf and you're having to reopen that. So signing out, I just want to show you, is basically the exact same process. So if I search for my name again, click on that. This time it's only asking me for my phone number verification. So the last 4 digits of my phone number, which it did ask for from me previously. It's not asking me the questions again because I have already been presented those questions today. So those questions are presented once every 24-hour period. So if someone's signing in and out a bunch throughout one day, they only answer those questions once per day. Tomorrow, if I came back in, I'd have to answer those questions again. The terms and conditions are presented only if the volunteer does not have an updated or a current signature for this set of terms and conditions. All right, but if I go ahead and verify here, then I can click on sign out, and that will record exactly how long I was here down to the minute based on my time of sign in and sign out. All right, so that is the standard sign-in console. Now again, that is generally opened by logging in through the admin side of Service and then clicking on Event or Project Sign-in Console under the Event or Project Management heading. But there is also a way to capture a direct link for your sign-in console. This is something that you would need to get from our customer support team. So if you have any questions about that, please go down to the bottom of your page, click on Need Help, and submit a support request. They can give you a direct link to your sign-in console. You would just need to tell them which settings you want to use from these settings that we talked about. So that direct link to the sign-in console is to the standalone version of the sign-in console, the sign-in mode. So it's intended for your volunteers. It's something that is kind of a security feature in a sense. You should not be distributing that to volunteers or posting that on your website directly because that lets people sign in from anywhere. That should be something that you choose to bookmark on a particular device, let's say. Like you could have a laptop or a tablet where you've bookmarked that on the home screen. So when someone boots up the tablet, they can just click on that link and it opens the sign-in console. All right, so in addition to the standard sign-in console itself, there is, of course, a version for volunteers to use, and that's called mobile sign-in. So mobile sign-in is something that would allow volunteers to use their own phone as the sign-in device. Mobile sign-in is something that you must turn on every event or project independently. So if there are certain events where you want to utilize it and certain events where you don't, you have that option. When you add a new event or if you update an existing event, there is an option to allow mobile sign-in. It's about halfway through the page. You can see it says allow mobile volunteer sign-in. The default option here is no. So if you don't have this turned on, it's not going to show up anywhere. Volunteers won't be able to utilize it. Any of the yes options means that when someone registers for this event, they will be presented with, in the confirmation email, a link to sign in. So that link is unique to that person. It's unique for this event. They can't use it to sign in for other things. They can't have their family members use it to sign in. It's just for them. And that link would allow them to sign in for their shift the day of the event, and as long as they meet other conditions. Those conditions could be a geofencing. So you can enable mobile sign-in with a geofence. Basically, they have to be within a certain radius of the location address itself. So let's say I say within 1 mile of this event. That's based on the event meeting location address. As a reminder, event meeting location address can be a street address. It can be cross streets. It can be GPS coordinates. Anything you would put into Google Maps, you can put into this field, and that's what it'll utilize to generate that radius. So if you have this turned on with a radius, when a volunteer clicks on the sign-in link, again, they get that in their confirmation email and in the reminder email for this event. When they click on that link, it's going to check two things. First of all, is it the day of the event? They can't sign in if it's not. Second of all, are they within the radius of the location address? If those two conditions are met, then the volunteer is able to sign in basically the same manner as the sign-in console that we just looked at. And in fact, those questions and the terms can be presented to your volunteers as well. So this is, again, with a radius around it. There are two other options here if you want to utilize the sign-in console, or mobile sign-in rather, without geofencing. You can either do any location or ignore location. In either of these two cases, the volunteer is not going to be geofenced around a particular location. But if you choose any location, it will actually still record the volunteer's GPS coordinates when they sign in. So if you are having volunteers operate remotely, like on an adopt a trail type of event, or something where they're doing trail maintenance on their own, or anything like that where a volunteer is operating kind of on their own, this is a pretty nice safety feature. It'll keep track of where they signed in from, and you can go back and report on that or view that in the actual entry. Ignore location does exactly what the name sounds like. All it records is the date and time of sign in, and then same thing for sign out. So that's mobile sign-in. Now I mentioned the link for mobile sign-in is sent to volunteers in the confirmation email, as well as in the reminder email. But this can also be sent out in a reminder SMS message. So if you have texting enabled in Service, you can have reminder text messages sent any number of days, 1 to 7, 2, 3, or 4 weeks beforehand. And that text message will also include the mobile sign-in link. All right. So that's kind of an overview of the sign-in console and mobile sign-in in general. Now I want to talk about where to find these settings that we've been talking about. So all of the settings for the sign-in console and mobile sign-in are found in the same place where all of your other global settings are found, and that's the system configuration. So under System Management, you have Edit System Configuration. If we click into that menu, there is a section devoted to the event or project sign-in console options. So if we go ahead and expand that, that's about halfway through the page. The first option here is walk-in registration. So we talked about that setting. The default for this is no, but you can turn this on and allow walk-in registration. And you can also choose to allow that with reservation codes. That just means that if you have reserved some spots, then volunteers could actually use reservation codes day of as well. This is generally used pretty heavily with groups. In particular, if you have like corporate groups that are working with you or things like that, where an organization is sending a certain number of people, you can have them all sign in day of using a reservation code. The next feature is enabling automatic sign out. So I mentioned earlier that the sign-in console can be used to modify hours. When volunteers sign in and sign out, it changes how many hours they're getting for that shift. That's true for events. But with events, you can also just have volunteers sign in and not out, and then they'll receive whatever the default credit hours for that particular event are. For service projects, that's not the same. For service projects, you don't define a default number of credit hours, and so you do need volunteers to both sign in and out. And this setting would basically provide a safety net. If someone forgets to sign out for a service project, or this also applies in the case of events that are worth 0 credit hours, then the system will just go through at the end of the evening and check, is anybody still signed in for a service project? And then if they are, it'll sign them out and give them 1 hour of credit. So this takes place at night. It's not a cap, so it's not preventing people from recording more than 1 hour in this case. It just means if they forget to sign out, they're going to get 1 hour of credit. The next two options have to do with the printing options. So name tags, the automated printing. If you want to turn that on, you can. You can also define the locations where you have printers. All right, and then below that, we're getting into the newer content, and that would be your sign-in console custom questions. So there are 3 custom questions you can generate. The examples that I have a selection box question, which means the volunteers choose between items that I've provided. But you could also have volunteers enter in some text, enter in a date, an email address, a phone number, or just a number. You can make these questions required or optional. And then you can also choose if these questions are presented on both the standard sign-in console and mobile sign-in, or just one or the other. So if you have something that only applies to mobile sign-in, of course you could do that, or you can have things apply to both. Below that is the custom question text, which is the actual question itself. And then next you have your responses. Now this options section is only going to apply if you have selected to use a selection box. And this is where you're providing multiple responses. So I just made a simple yes/no question, but I could have other items listed in here. You just add a comma and then add the next item, and that will create additional entries for that question. Now, if you are using a selection box question, then you can limit sign-in or require a particular answer. So this is what I showed in my system. If someone said yes, they had symptoms, or yes, they'd been in contact with someone who tested positive, then they wouldn't actually be able to sign in. And that's because I made it a requirement that people said no to both of those questions. So this only applies, again, if you're doing selection box, and it would have to match one of the custom questions. All right, so that's how these questions are established. And again, there are 3 of these. And you can write out, your questions however you want to do that. You do not have to utilize these. They are disabled by default. And these can change too. So unlike questions on your application, where that information is tied to the question, it's tied to the volunteer's profile. These questions are stored as notes, or the volunteer's responses rather, are stored as notes on the volunteer account, in addition to the actual question itself. So you'll see the full content of the question and the volunteer's response tied as a note on the volunteer's profile and timestamped when they input that information. So you'll always be able to go back and historically see this whenever volunteers answer these questions or surveys. They're on their account, and that's searchable information as well. So because of that, if you change any of these questions, some of these are just relevant for a certain time period, you can modify these questions, and you don't need to be concerned about losing any information or having incorrect data tied to these questions, because they're not stored on the volunteer's profile as a part of the application. They're stored in their notes. All right, so that's those 3 questions. Directly below that is the sign-in console custom question failure message. This appears if a volunteer does not answer a question the way that you need them to. So you can edit this text. We do have some default language in here about, double checking that they answered it accurately, otherwise to see some staff. But you can modify this note if you need to. Below that is your terms and conditions option, so during sign-in. In order for this to be active at all, you do need to be utilizing your terms and conditions. So the terms and conditions are edited in the system configuration as well. They're found in the page content section, and they are the last item. So you'll see here you can change your display terms and conditions in terms of whether they're displayed inline or people can click to view the content. You can also change how people respond to these, whether it's just a checkbox or if they have to type their signature as well, which is how we have ours set up. And then the actual terms themselves are established within here. So they do have to be enabled in order to utilize this feature. But if they are turned on, then you can have them displayed as a part of sign-in. And again, this can be either for just the sign-in console, so the standalone version, or just mobile sign-in, or both. And then, of course, you can turn those off as well. Off is the default, so no is the default for this field. The last item is your sign-in console verification method. I would certainly encourage you to utilize this if you are using terms and conditions or these questions. It simply asks volunteers to input the last 4 digits of their phone number in order to confirm their account. Now, they're not inputting their password like they would if they're logging into their profile, because they're not actually accessing their full account information. They're just signing in or checking in. So there's not, a password requirement here, but it uses the last 4 digits of their phone number, either their primary or their alternate phone number. All right, so that's where the settings are found to modify any of those new settings, and then, of course, anything pertaining to the sign-in console itself. So today we overviewed the sign-in console, including how your volunteers interact with it, both the standalone sign-in console and mobile sign-in. We talked about creating those custom sign-in questions and then also incorporating your terms and conditions into the sign-in process. So our team has been answering questions throughout the call, but I will be taking questions for the larger group as they continue to come in. So please feel free to keep writing in your questions. We'll go ahead and see if there are any appropriate ones for the group here. All right, so it looks like we did have a question about what if there are more than 3 questions, kind of how to combine that information. So if you do have more than 3 questions to ask your volunteers, you could combine that data just by using more of like a text field. So again, going back to these settings in the system configuration, you could set your question type. Instead of something like selection box, you could do a text entry. And that allows volunteers to type in a certain number of characters. So they can basically just write in a response as opposed to being limited to the type of formatting or what kind of responses they could provide. You do have quite a bit of space to ask a question in the text field. The limit for this is 320 characters. So there's quite a bit of space in there. But yeah, then you could just allow volunteers to write in a response to a question that you're asking. Another question about where to review this information on volunteer accounts. And that's something you'll find in the volunteer database. So if you go into Search and Manage Volunteer Database, you can look up a volunteer by name. And if you click to View Profile Details, this is where the notes are found on a volunteer account. So we can scroll down, and if we click on Show More, we'll see the notes tied to this person's profile. And any entry from the sign-in questionnaire will be time-stamped when it was answered. It also has the term sign-in questionnaire, and then, of course, the actual questions and the volunteer's responses. So the full data of the question is listed out so that you get all of that information listed here. And then, of course, you also get the volunteer's responses within that. Now, all of this information is searchable, including the term sign-in questionnaire. So if you wanted to find volunteers who have that kind of information on their profile, you could search by that data. Okay, another question came in about the terms and conditions in terms of where to edit that information. So that's found again in the system configuration, and that's under the page content section. And it's the last item. So this is where you would establish the terms and conditions intro text, as well as the terms and conditions themselves, and then any settings related to those. I do also want to mention when a volunteer signs these terms, that's stored on the volunteer's profile as a date, and you can also download a record of that information. So if you go into the volunteer database again, and you click to view a volunteer's profile details, so same as we did to view the notes, and you scroll down, you'll be able to see the accepted terms and conditions dates. The system will store up to 10 of these, and they are clickable links. If you click on that link, it will download basically the volunteer's terms as a PDF. So you can see their information. You can see the terms that they agreed to. So these are the actual terms that they agreed to at that point. And then at the bottom, you'll also see their signature information. All right, one last question just pertaining to the questionnaire itself and whether those show up on the standalone sign-in console or mobile sign-in. And just to reiterate, you can choose for each question if they show up on either the mobile sign-in option, so volunteers' own phones, or the standalone sign-in console, or both. So when you create your questions in the system configuration, there is an option to select where this question specifically will show up. So you do have the option to select that for each question that you create. Very good question. All right, and then someone asked to see an example of walk-in registration. So walk-in registration, again, is the idea that a volunteer had not previously registered for an event, but instead are just showing up. Now, that could be a brand new volunteer who's never worked with you before, or it could be someone who already has an account, but they're not registered for a shift today. Let's walk through the example of a brand new volunteer. So if we have the sign-in console open in sign-in mode, and I'm going to set the quick reg option for this walk-in registration. That just means they don't have to create as long of a profile. I'm going to click on sign-in mode here, and then let's say a volunteer looks up their name and they don't see their account. That means that they don't have a profile, and they can click on Add New Volunteer. So when they do that, it's going to present them with a truncated version of the application page, in this case, because I chose to use quick reg. So they'll input their last name, first name, primary phone, email. So as they input that information, again, this would be for a new account. Then they'll also have to agree to the terms in my case, so I've chosen to include that as a part of this process, but that's up to you. So when you create your, in this case, the Quick Reg application, you can choose how much information is included. So I have name, phone, email, plus birth date, plus terms and conditions, but that's up to you when you create those. So when someone fills this out, they click on Submit. That will create their profile. And because I have questions turned on as well, it will immediately prompt them to answer those questions before they can sign in. So same thing we saw previously. They need to respond to these questions. And once they've done that, then they will be able to sign in the same manner that we saw previously. So for a walk-in registration, so for a new person, they're not going to be registered for anything yet. So all that they will see is what is currently available for walk-in registration. So events that have positions available or events that don't have restrictions on them that would allow people to walk in. So otherwise, it's the same process. You click sign in, it'll say they've been signed in, and they can use the exact same process now to sign out. So this person then has a new profile in the system. So they would get a confirmation email, and then you can, of course, go and review their account information. So let me just show you. We just created a new account for that person by going through that process. So if we search the volunteer database, they do have a full profile, even though we used Quick Reg. That just means that they haven't filled out all of their account information yet. So if we look to view profile details, it's only the things that we filled in: name, phone, email, birth date, and then terms and conditions. Everything else on the application will be filled out by this person the next time that they log into their account or the next time they register for an event from home. So there is one more question I want to address here, and that would be the idea of if an administrator would be able to sign out a volunteer if they use the sign-in feature on their own. So the answer to that is yes. So there's actually two ways that an admin could sign out a volunteer who has signed in on their own. One would be through using the event or project sign-in console in admin mode. So I showed this earlier. This allows you to see everybody who's currently signed in, and you can go through and sign out people or cancel their sign-ins. You have these exact same options presented to you as an admin. If you go into the event database, if you look at a particular event, you can, if you go to view the registered volunteers, you can go in and just sign people in or out directly. And you can also see the sign-in console activity in here as well. You can see when someone signed in, when someone signed out, and if their hours have been adjusted. But you can take those same actions on this page. If we scroll to the bottom, there's an option to sign in, sign out, or cancel sign in. Okay, I do think we have one more question that I want to identify because it's a pretty big question. And that's the idea of how do you review the answers to the questions as an admin. I did cover it a little bit earlier, but I want to reiterate because that's a pretty important topic. So as an admin, you can review the volunteers' responses to sign-in questionnaire questions on their profile. That data is stored permanently, so it will not disappear after a certain amount of time. It is stored on their profile in the notes section. So you can search for volunteers who have answered the questionnaire by using the advanced volunteer search and searching through the volunteer notes. You could search for the term questionnaire, for example, and that would pull up any volunteer who has answered the questionnaire, and it would give you their responses as well if you click into view their profile. So when you click to view the profile of a volunteer, at the bottom, you can click to show more, and then that will bring up their notes. So we can see here the notes on their account, and this is where those sign-in questionnaire questions are stored, as well as the volunteers' responses. So you can see the data from the questionnaire, the date and time that the person answered the questions. You can see the questions themselves and the volunteers' responses. And again, this is stored permanently, so this will always be present on the volunteer's profile as long as their record exists. All right, that's a very good question. All right, I think that is it for today. So if there are a few more questions out there still waiting on support, we'll go ahead and leave this open, but that is all the content that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining. If you do have more questions, again, contact our customer support team.